Carol Roth is a former investment banker, entrepreneur, TV pundit, and host, and appears on national television networks including Fox Business, CNN, CNBC, Fox News, MSNBC, and many other outlets, and is a New York Times bestselling author of The Entrepreneur Equation and her most recent book, The War on Small Business: How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America, is a must-read. And you can find Carol's lively feed on Twitter at Carol JS Roth. Welcome, Carol. How are you?
David, great introduction. We should just warn people up front that if you're going to check out the lively feed, you must be in a lively mood. I usually say you have to have a warped sense of humor in order to enjoy it.
You know, I'm a firm believer in the 80% majority. A friend of mine, Ken Emmons, wrote a book called The 80% Majority. And on Twitter, you find the 10% extremes are a lot louder than the rest of us that I would consider, you may be right of center or left of center, but we're not, we're not the Twitter wackos.
Right.
I think you give a really good sense of proportion in what's going on in the news and talk about it from a fairly free market, point of view, which is definitely needed on that platform.
Thank you. Yes, I get a lot of your common sense isn't allowed on this platform. Didn't you get the message? And no, I still have not gotten the message.
Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, I've been following you for well over a decade, and it's an honor to have you join us. So thank you.
It's been my pleasure and my privilege.
So as small business advocates here, our primary focus is those businesses that the Small Business Administration deems as small business. The latest SBA report from 2021 demonstrates that the United States has 32.5 million small businesses, which employ 61.2 million people. That represents 99.9% of all U.S. businesses. Carol, as we saw the destruction of small businesses throughout the pandemic, we watched as the larger corporations were deemed essential. Mom and pops were basically thrown to the curb. Over a third of them have closed their doors. Paraphrasing your book, who declared war on small business?
Well, I think it's a coordinated effort, David. There is, if you look at the economy, and I'm glad you kind of gave the scope of those stats to start with, because not a lot of people realize those stats. But if you take those numbers that you threw out there and you kind of divide the economy in half, before COVID, small businesses accounted for about half the GDP and about half the jobs, and were certainly the biggest hirers that were out there. The other half of the economy is basically consolidated within the purview of 20 some odd thousand big businesses. And so if you think about sort of this unholy triumvirate between big government, big business, and big special interest, there's really a there, because if they want to, it's starting from the government side, if they want to get things done, if they want to get lobbying dollars, if they want to get contributions to their campaigns, who is it easier to go after? Is it easier to go after 20,000 firms that have deep pockets and are fairly easy to control and to collaborate with? Or is it easier to go after 32.5 million very free thinkers, independent spirited type of people across all different kinds of geographies, all different kinds of industries and the like? I mean, it's pretty obvious when you kind of put it in that perspective. And I think that's what happens. It becomes this very cozy relationship where, maybe it starts in the government, or maybe it starts with big business and there's a call for regulation, but they all benefit from what I'm calling this great consolidation, the moving of more power and purview and resources and dollars and wealth to that very consolidated part of the economy, which obviously doesn't benefit the rest of us. It doesn't benefit the rest of us in terms of economic freedom, in terms of choice of products and services, in terms of innovation, in terms of wealth creation opportunities and the like. So that's really, I think, the battle that we're up against.
So, it's interesting because I follow politics relatively closely. I think, the regulatory state has a significant and profound impact on small business owners. You've got the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that are speaking for the larger corporations. You've got the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and state capitals all over the country. Outside of a smaller organization like the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, who represents the small business lobby?
Nobody. I mean, that's really the problem, that, locally there are chambers that stand up for small businesses, but when you get to that national level, they're really focused maybe on the biggest of the small businesses and kind of up from there. Although they will tell you differently, I just haven't seen that in terms of their materials, and I've told them so myself.
Yeah.
So I'm not sharing anything that's different here. And even, a group, again, like the SBA, they are very focused. Well, first of all, they're very focused on photo opportunities and not really doing a whole lot. But the stuff that they do, again, is with that bigger set of small businesses. Of those 32.5 million, around 6 million of them even have employees. The rest are solo businesses. And then obviously we know there's a wide net between the ones that have one employee and the one that has, 500 employees.
Right.
It still kind of counts for the SBA. And so, in terms of really kind of getting in there and advocating for the free market and for that small business, again, because small business is so decentralized, you really don't have that, voice that's out there, with the dollars behind it, making a big splash.
I want to talk about the current situation that we're finding ourselves in with the economy. I feel like we're standing on the shore and the water is rapidly withdrawing from the shore. We've got a tsunami about to hit, I feel, at least from an economic standpoint. But let's go back to your book here for a minute, because 2 years ago, the stock market crashed. It came back relatively quickly. It was probably the quickest recession, if you clinically can call it that, that we've seen in decades. But what happened? Let's talk about small business as far as, dealing with the regulatory state and obviously the psychological impact of the pandemic.
Yeah. So, I mean, everyone wants to talk about the pandemic, but this is really the government reaction to the pandemic. And when you hear people say, oh, well, we were all in this together and we all went through the lockdowns, we did not. What they did was they chose winners and losers, and they chose who was going to thrive and who was going to fight to survive. And lo and behold, those who were smaller and lacked the political clout and connections really bore the brunt of those shutdown mandates. At the same time, again, sort of unsurprisingly, the very first thing that was done alongside these shutdowns was the support of Wall Street. So you had sort of a two-headed monster going on. You had these small businesses being closed, and so people couldn't shop there, and so their dollars were headed to bigger companies instead. At the same time, you had the Fed throwing trillions of dollars into the market to support it. And that increased the valuation of these big public companies as well. So you had, by the end of 2020, 7 tech companies gained $3.4 trillion in value. Now, granted, a lot of that has been, if not all of it's been given back, which just goes to show how destructive it is. But that's a sidebar. At the same time, by June of 2020, 400,000 small businesses had been murdered by mandate. So that's kind of the disparate scenario that went on in terms of the treatment of the different entities. And with the monetary policy from the Fed, with the fiscal policy, this relief act after relief act, throwing more dollars into the supply constrained economy, particularly in 2021 in March, the American Rescue Plan, after we were starting to open up, we had the vaccines, there was absolutely no reason, lots of us standing up screaming, do not do this. We already have a kindling inflation, do not throw fire on the flame. Oh, it's not going to do anything. We know the outgrowth of that now.
What was that? 1.5, 1.6 trillion?
1.9.
1.9.
1.9 trillion additional on top of, all of this other, quote unquote relief that was thrown in there. And then you had just really bad government policies, things that, scared the heck out of people, so that they, didn't know if their kids were going to be able to stay in school, so they couldn't go back and get a job. And all of these things just kind of added fuel to the fire and created this tailwind situation, this long-term tail effect that small businesses are shouldering in terms of a disrupted labor market, a disrupted supply chain and massive inflation. And when you look at like the labor market, you're like, well, we're reclaiming, a lot of those jobs. The ADP's last survey for April 2022 was horrifying. I actually just recently tweeted about it. They had 367,000, I think, jobs that were reclaimed between big and medium-sized businesses. Small businesses lost 120,000 people from their payroll. Again, these 6 million businesses versus the 20,000. The consolidation impact and the long-term impact of these decisions and how they're disparately affecting different size businesses, which makes sense in terms of scale and resources, is just, history is going to look back on this and say, this had to be intentional, because what would you have done any differently? And I'm privileged that I was able to write and be able to document it for history before history is changed by the media.
It's interesting. We put this graph up here for our audience. And when you talk about the ADP payroll for April last month, the mainstream media, and I don't want to get too political on this because I believe that there are shenanigans on both sides. Both sides like to spend. Both sides.
It's a systemic issue.
It's a systemic issue. And when you devalue the currency by printing $1.9 trillion, and that's before all of the other programs that have been.
Oh yeah, no. They printed between the Fed printed 6, and then you had all the government, another 6.6 in government spending on top.
Right.
Of that. So, yeah.
But if we take a look, if you just turn on any news broadcast right now, the fact is that unemployment, which has been a measure which I think has been somewhat, let's just say, played with over the past. It's like the CPI. The CPI statistics today are not the same CPI statistics in 1982.
Correct.
There's different barometers and different measurements. So apples to apples, just a side note here, apples to apples, inflation, if we were using the 1982 indexing that was used when Ronald Reagan was a relatively fresh president, we would be over 16% inflationary right now.
I've seen it like at 17.7. There's a site called Shadow Statistics. I think it's shadowstats.com, and they go through the whole methodology of all the things that have been changed. But you don't need an economist or a site to tell you that, right? You can go in and see how much more you're paying. I'm paying 50% more for a hamburger meal. Go to a hotel, I'm paying 3 times as much. You can see this in your everyday lives. You don't need a CPI index to tell you these things.
Yeah, no, it's everything. But going back to your ADP report, which you posted, when we talk about small businesses between 1 and 50 employees, this is the number that we were talking about at the beginning here. This is where the SBA reports, we're talking about, 99% of employers in this country. Right. And they lost 120,000. But if we turn on the news right now, Carol, it's celebration regarding the employment numbers, isn't it?
Everything is being kind of told in a very glossy sort of way with no level of nuance. And it's hard because somebody is a generally optimistic person and try to paint a rosy picture. There aren't a lot of really happy pockets right now, and I try to be realistic. I try to kind of say, here's what you're seeing, but here's kind of the components. And the media is not playing that game. Certainly, the Biden White House isn't playing that game. And we really need a reckoning of accountability here, because the powers that be that cause this, in large part, the Federal Reserve and the governments, and not just, by the way, the administration, but Congress, they're the ones with the authority for budgets, right? They told us along the way this was not going to happen. I document inflation is going to be fine. It's going to run a little hot. It's going to be transitory. It's going to be good for you. Mm-hmm. It is your fault as a consumer. It is a greedy business's fault. Now it's Putin's fault. And they've just kind of gone through this whole litany and trying to pretend like they never said the thing before. And if the experts can't figure out something that was entirely predictable, I was not the only one. There were many people out there saying this is economics 101. We all know what's going to happen here. Don't do this. they shouldn't be in charge of those kinds of decisions. They're playing with us. And the most frustrating thing, David, for me, is they inflated the markets. The markets have now given a large percentage of that back. So it went up, but it came back down.
Yeah.
And they did so supposedly to avoid a recession in the economy, which they're going to end up having to drag us into to combat the inflation that they created. So instead of just letting us have a little bit of pain from the stupid decisions they made up front, which, by the way, if Amazon's warehouse had to close and the stock market felt pain, this whole thing would have lasted 2 weeks and we would have all gone along on our merry way and we wouldn't be in this scenario to begin with. But if we just had that temporary pain, we did have this short recession came out of it, we could have done so without all of this other dislocation of the labor market, the supply chain, and massive, massive inflation, which we're never going to get back. And we're going to still end up with that recession anyway. So what was this all for?
You know, I'm listening to you and you're talking about how the quote unquote experts, they predicted transitory inflation. Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, all of them stood up there at Congress, news conferences and the like, and they predicted transitory. It's funny. I've got son in college and a son in high school. All right. And so, you look at things through the lens of their eyes. And I remember being a kid, even younger than them. And I used to think adults knew what they were doing. You remember that? It's like, because you get to a certain age, you must know something. And, we've had 2 years, especially in 2021, of predictions that the economy was fine. We just need to spend more. You need to pass this bill. You need to pass that bill. And just in the past few weeks, finally, people are starting to admit, and the mainstream media are now starting to report. We've got Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein. He's talking about a very, 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 he used the words very, very high risk of a recession. Odeon Capital Group's chief financial strategist, Dick Bove, says that we're going to have to see interest rates go up fairly significantly from here if we're going to cut the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. There is going to be a recession. Harvard University economics professor Kenneth Rogoff, he warned on Friday that it will be really hard to get the inflation rate down without causing a recession. The Empire State Manufacturing Index just yesterday reported that they were expecting plus 16.5. That's the headline number. And what they're showing right now is the manufacturing index, instead of being plus 16.5%, it's negative 11.6%. So now they're talking about inflation. I mean, Ben Bernanke, his latest book says we made mistakes. Will there be, besides obviously small business owners feeling the brunt of this, you referred to the experts. Will any of them stand up and say, yeah, we messed up?
No, because there will be no accountability for them. It's not like they have to say that. I mean, Jerome Powell has kind of said like, oh, we were behind the curve. Yeah, no, bleep. Obviously we know that, but not at the level of like, boy, we just got the entire thing wrong. Because I'm not sure that they didn't know that this was going to be the outcome. Maybe not exactly the way that it played out, but I feel like they were running a different mandate and just seeing how long they could do it and get away with it. And I personally believe, and I know not everyone thinks this way, that this is a game of chicken. And, as soon as we start getting the recessionary, kind of statistics, we already have 1/4 of GDP going down. I'm not sure if the consumer can save the next quarter. We'll find out, but just from a math perspective, it's going to be difficult. Maybe we get a little bit of growth. But I think this is a Fed that has a mandate to support the markets and to support government spending. They can't let the interest that we're paying on the debt get, it's already out of hand, but further out of hand. And so I think that they're going to turn dovish and go back to a more accommodative stance, or at least do nothing sooner than most people predict, because that's where they're comfortable, and that's where they think their mandate is, which actually isn't the mandate that's been given by Congress.
So Jerome Powell has hinted to the fact that there's going to be multiple interest rate increases at probably not 25 basis, but 50 basis points at a time. So you're suggesting that that may not happen, that may not occur, or may
So
not be as many?
I think there won't be as many. I mean, Wall
Okay.
Street's basically pricing in like 50 basis points at every single meeting. I think he gets as high as maybe 2%. And then he just doesn't have the fortitude to get any higher. Because you have to remember too, that they're not only raising interest rates, but they're running off a historic balance sheet, which also has downward pressure on, interest rates in the markets. So, you've got two of these things going on at the same time, at sort of historic levels. And I just don't believe that, he and the Open Market Committee is going to have the fortitude to do, to kind of take us into real normalization, which, looks like something like before it did, 2006, maybe 2007, before the Great Recession financial crisis. We have not seen normalcy since that time. It's been 15 years, and it's just been like, one period of insanity, a little bit of starting to drift. Oh, the market freaks out, we're not going to do that. And you just hasn't had the fortitude. If you're Jerome Powell and you came in March of 2020 with this emergency cut and this emergency program because you had to stabilize the market, and in June of 2020, the NASDAQ's hitting all-time highs, why are you doing anything there? Why aren't you saying the emergency is clearly over? We've stabilized the stock market. We'll stand by in case something else goes on, and we'll be on our merry way. If that's really what they wanted to do, you had an all-time high. I mean, this is not an emergency market situation. He chose not to do that, and here we are.
So what you're pointing to is something that I find really interesting, and it's something that I've discussed a lot. We had Adam Millsap on a couple of weeks ago from Forbes. Super great guy, very, very intelligent. One of the questions that I've had, and I've been talking about this since 2009, is, the Fed, I understand what they needed to do in 2008, 2009. I think we all agree that there needed to be liquidity in the market, or there wouldn't have been any milk on the store shelves. Okay, I understand that. But nobody predicted quantitative easing and the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve to increase over the next 14 years. It was supposed to be a temporary measure. Ben Bernanke talked about this, that he was a student of the Great Depression, as you know, and he said, if they did this in the Great Depression, it would have offset the impact on millions of families. I get that. But through the politics, nobody wanted to be president or have an administration overseeing a recession. So I get that pressure from a political standpoint. But again, experts, didn't anybody stand up in the room and said, we're kicking this can down the road. Eventually, Newton's law, what goes up must come back down. The balloon eventually will pop. The bubble will pop. Is that what we're seeing happening right now?
I mean, it's like trying to explain crazy. It's all political. It's they become a political animal. They're supposed to be independent. They've never really been independent. It was the cloak of independence, as I talk about in the book, that started this. They've always been this quasi-government agency. That they have their mandate from Congress. They give their profits back to the Treasury. How independent is that? They're really hand in hand. And, so they're trying to achieve other objectives. And the reality is, as a free market capitalist, I don't think that we need this. I feel like we would have much smoother cycles, and it would be much more fair and equal to the extent, of just market fairness, and not having somebody put their thumb on the scale and tip the playing field towards the bigger players. If that were the case, I mean, we have no explanation for why this was necessarily, certainly not at this scope, and certainly not for this duration. And, if we're not going to try and get some meaningful reform done now on the back of this, it's never going to happen. And they will do what, every other central bank and kind of financial empire has done in history, and continue to debase the currency. I mean, this goes back to the Roman Empire, and that sees eventually the end of the financial empire, and it's by mandate.
Tell me the impact on small business that devaluing our fiat currency, our dollar, has, and what you're seeing currently right now.
Oh my God, there's so many things. The process of what they did, both in terms of suppressing interest rates, printing money, doing QE. What it did was it allowed the biggest companies that have the ability, or some that didn't have the ability, but they gave them the ability to take on debt, to get more capital, to be able to compete with small businesses. By the way, this came at the expense also not just of small businesses, but of savers and retirees who are now earning nothing on their money as risk was disrupted in the market. But basically it said, if you're a big business, we're going to give you all this capital, go out, grow, do whatever you need. And sorry, small business, because you have to personally guarantee this stuff, you don't have the ability to take any more of that. That's too bad. So that's certainly one piece of it. The second piece of it is the inflationary piece, which has obviously it's moved into the number one issue, past labor for small businesses right now. And again, if you're a big business, you can say, well, maybe I'll pare back my accounting department, or maybe I'll close an underperforming unit, and you can kind of rationalize your business. If your business is one location, you don't have that flexibility. Like, you either make that work or you have no business. So again, it has created a undue set of burdens in terms of the small businesses being able to compete. And then obviously, it makes it harder for them to hire, both the disruption of the labor market, people saying their 401ks going up in the value of their houses and just dropping out of the labor market, and then flowing into this fact that we now have this huge supply demand imbalance. And so, the big businesses, as we talked about the ADP report, they're able to bring some of these people back, and the small businesses just aren't able to do that. And then obviously, the supply chain issues, and it just kind of becomes a downward spiral. And the worst part about all of this is that the numbers, the real scope of this is going to be buried. Because another thing that happened is, even though my estimate is it's probably between 1 million and 2 million businesses that were killed. I know you cited the 1/3 numbers. The 1/3 numbers aren't correct. Those are of kind of, I've talked to the people who wrote up the studies, and they looked at certain kinds of businesses, and I haven't quite been able to get
and the like.
Yeah, I can't get the scope. I mean, it's still a staggering amount if it's 1 to 2 million, given the fact there's only 20,000 big businesses. But you've had those, and many of those were long-standing family businesses with employees that had been around. Some have been around for 100 years. Those have been closed, but in the meantime, because people were staying home or they're working from home, they were looking for side hustles, they all registered LLCs or S Corps or whatever, and said, oh, well, I'm going to day trade on Robinhood on the side, or I'm going to have an Etsy store or whatever. And so net, that 32.5 million small business number looks way higher than it did before the pandemic. But you've now swapped out a bunch of these kind of like hobby businesses for real long-standing businesses. So if you don't look beyond the headline, you're not really seeing the carnage. You have to kind of look for clues elsewhere.
What do you think the psychological impact is on the macro, the broader economy, especially when it comes to you're a stalwart for entrepreneurship. You promote entrepreneurship. You talk about it. I've been watching you for years, promoting the individual business owner. You find a need and you fill it, right? Let's talk about the impact of the last couple of years on entrepreneurship, on starting new businesses. What do you see as far as the trajectory moving forward from here?
Well, I think it depends for existing small business owners and then new small business owners. Existing small business owners have just had a tough time. There are all types of serious depression and other mental health issues that have come about. And they've just borne the brunt of everything, and many are just hanging on by a thread, some mentally, some financially or otherwise. So it's a really tough position, and I'm just not sure if we go through a recession here, how many of them make it out the other side. On the new business formation standpoint, entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs are the most optimistic people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody who has a good idea, the first book I wrote, The Entrepreneur Equation, was the motivational book about why it's so hard to run a small business, kind of to say, make sure you know what you're getting into. But I think because America does have this branding of, this is the place of the American dream and the entrepreneurship, not enough people have really looked, kind of underneath the hood to say, here's the reality of what we're facing. And so I imagine that we will see a lot of people continue to try, to the extent they have the financial wherewithal to do so, but should try to start businesses. And obviously the environment is becoming more and more difficult for them to do so. We know the failure rates approximately on small businesses. So I would imagine that those will not slow down. If anything, they will accelerate.
Yeah, yeah. And, we go in to help smaller businesses that are challenged. This is kind of the cornerstone of our market that we more or less created over 3 decades ago now. When we're looking at the, I keep using the word psychology. That was originally a career that I was going to go into, clinical psychology.
I see all the books behind you, so that's not surprising.
I'm still, I should say, dealing with Est from the 70s and the 80s, So, but the thing here that I'm absolutely amazed by, you pointed it out. You said that entrepreneurs are generally optimistic.
Yeah.
They're glass half full individuals. And the idea of owning and operating your own business is a sense of freedom that you don't get from working for, a large corporation where you're just a cog in the wheel. There's benefits to that, and there's obviously some significant drawbacks and negatives. I mean, you sleep, eat, and drink and think about your business when you own your business. It's your baby. But what, from a generational standpoint, do you believe the kids that you talk to today, college, young adults, do you believe the idea of free markets, free enterprise, individualism, and entrepreneurship is being taught?
So I think it depends on the kid and where they're getting their information. Obviously, the school system is going completely in the opposite direction and creating a lot of really stupid ideas. But the good news is that they also have very lived experience. And so, I was talking to an entrepreneur today about his children and the abuse that they suffered at the hands of the school system, and how, he had a son who was an A student that for the first time in his life was failing and was depressed because, of the change in the school situation, when kids, we saw statistically weren't at risk. So I think, having lived through this sort of authoritarian abuse and had that as part of your formative years, and the fact that so many of your important experiences were taken away by mandate, I would imagine as students, get out of the school system and into the real world, that is going to be a foundational understanding and truth for them that will push them towards more individual rights and freedom type of ideas, even if they're not there yet. I can go back to myself when I was in school, and I went to a business school. I went to Wharton undergrad, so I was always kind of interested in business, but it wasn't from like a rights-based standpoint. I'd never really learned that, and I certainly wasn't political. And it wasn't until I had gotten out into the real world and gotten my hands dirty and understood big businesses and small businesses and all the things, I really gained that level of appreciation. So I do think that, this generation has the opportunity to mature that way and to really shine a light on, like, oh my God, I can't believe these institutions told us this thing. Oh, but it makes sense, because don't forget, they completely abused us for multiple years and created, a lot of unnecessary trauma and stress in our lives.
Not to age myself, but college in the 1980s, we were raised by parents who believed in, if you can't afford it, you don't buy it. But then all of a sudden in the 1980s, I was offered credit cards as a college student, right?
My dad signed me up for one when I was 10 because he wanted to establish a credit history for me. So that was a financial lesson. That wasn't a 80s lesson.
Yeah, smart man. And you talk about your father in your writing as well. And my father, he played a major role in my perception and really, belief in the free market, entrepreneur credo. But we were, so the 1980s, we kind of saw this whole thing about debt. It didn't really exist before. Fair Isaac's company was formed, two graduate students from MIT in the late 60s, and the banks were like, oh, we can predict behavior here? Okay, let's start lending it out. Because when we were kids, it was like, remember the credit cards were Diners Club and Carte Blanche? That was it, right? So our generation, we 80s and 90s. Now we're considered the old folks, right? As far as the kids go. I'm a Gen Z. I'm Gen Xer. I'm not a boomer. Stop calling me a boomer, right? So the thing here is that there is now 30 years, maybe 40 years of using debt as a consumer, as an instrument for lifestyle. And undoubtedly, and we're seeing this worldwide now, lifestyle has improved dramatically for everybody. There's very, very few, first and second world countries where you don't have inside plumbing and heating and good fresh food, relatively close to you. So debt, I guess, can be used for a good thing. Is there? I guess there's the question for you being here is when we look at it from a perspective of how we are now, maybe the bill is due. We've got over $30 trillion in national debt, and household debt levels have increased dramatically. There's trillions of dollars worldwide now. People have, credit cards, college loans, car loans, mortgages, and the like. I guess going back to an earlier question for you, Carol, does that balloon pop? And if it does pop, or can it be deflated, which is going back to what we're talking about with the Federal Reserve trying to do right now? Can the air be let out slowly, or are we just heading, we've got a train coming to us full force right now?
Those are a lot of questions. I feel like we could spend a whole episode on those. I would say at first on the debt side, and most business owners will appreciate this, there's a difference between using debt for investment purposes and saying, I'm going to get a return on investment, and so this is a low cost of capital, and so I'm going to use this versus another sort of choice of capital versus your expenses. And, maybe an individual can sustain a little bit of putting some of the expenses, for some short period of time, but eventually, the bill comes due, figuratively and literally. And so I, unless you're in a completely dire straits for a very short period of time, unless it's being used for investment, like, you just shouldn't be using debt as a tool. And I think, countries, same thing. There's sort of a curve. There are some things that, are investments, but there are a lot of things that aren't. And frankly, most of what we use money for is to just move it around from one place to another. The government's not being productive. They're not creating anything. They're frankly just lying to people and, creating a ton of issues. So if you're the government and you have all of this debt and you're trying to get it under control, what do you do? You could stop spending that's politically, not very tenable. You can raise taxes only to a certain point. That slows the economy and is also not tenable, or you can debase the currency. And because people are so kind of caught up in that headline number, oh, well, I make six figures. Well, making six figures today, not there's anything wrong with that, but it's certainly not the same thing as making six figures 20 years ago. And certainly, as we're seeing today, in terms of buying goods and services, in terms of the inflated asset prices of trying to buy a house and whatnot. So even people who are doing well are finding themselves struggling. And a lot of that is, government-based inflation, both in terms of the places where they're taxing you, property taxes and this and that and the other thing, and the debasement of the currency. But because we don't have an economically literate population, they still think, six figures is six figures is six figures. And it just isn't. It's just not the same. And you can go back to sort of the beginning of empires, go back to the Roman empires, and they used to actually physically debase the currency. It used to have a certain amount of silver. They go, oh, we need some of that money. They'd melt it down. They'd reissue it with less silver and take that extra silver and go out and buy things and to the point where it wasn't worth anything. And that's sort of the trajectory. So in terms of, where do we go from here? As I said before, I think the Fed, and especially without any accountability on what they've been doing, leans towards that. I think politically, everything leans towards that. The only, thing that we have going on at the same time is that we have nations, the powerful nations around the world that are all doing the same thing, Japan and Europe. And what happens at the end of every financial empire is usually some sort of agreement to reset the clock and to change things around. So whether that comes from, going to some sort of a gold standard and marking the value of gold up and, letting that sort of change the value of everything else, or, restructuring some of the debts, which again, most of them are obligations to taxpayers. There's going to be a reckoning. There's only so many things that you can move around for so long. And at the level of debt that we have, the amount of our interest that's going to pay for debt, reckoning is going to happen sooner than many people realize.
Carol, last question, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time here for you, but you point towards something which I think a lot of people don't know these days. And, there's that old saying, it's some people say it's Mark Twain. I don't think it is, but they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes
it rhymes.
Right? Yes. And you've now referred to the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, three times. Just speaking with, a lot of people don't realize this, but devaluing their currency, the two major reasons, if you look at history, that it fell, devalued the currency, and they had open immigration policies whereby the Germanic hordes came in and infiltrated. Again, it's not exactly the same, but kind of rhyming right now.
I'm literally writing something. The reason it comes up so much is I'm literally writing something about this, and it's not just the Roman Empire, but it's also the Dutch Empire. It's also the British Empire. Yep. There's a lot of rhyming, and you've all seen this movie before, and you all know how it ends. Now, as I go back to the Roman Empire, Nero started debasing the currency in 54 AD, and took a couple 100+ years before things completely were kaput. But it was pretty bad times for some sort of interim period afterwards. So I'm not saying this necessarily happens right away, but you're going to start to see that writing on the wall. It may not happen in our lifetime, but Lord, we are on that downward trajectory for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. And what was it Albert Einstein said? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Anyway, last question for you, Carol. And I greatly appreciate you taking the time today. I think inarguably we may be in a recession now. At best case scenario, we're going to be going through a very challenging period. But what is your outlook for small business as a whole? Where do you see us in a couple, 3, 5 years from now?
So I think if you are a small business, and obviously, one of the things that's challenging about small business is this is not every industry and this is not every small business, because there are so many of you. So this is going to apply to some people and it's not going to apply. And some people are in better positions than others aren't. You know, we talk about small business, but not every small business, you know, views themselves as one of, you know, 32.5 million. But I think that, you know, if you are at all, unless you're in a place where you have a huge moat around you and you just, you know, you're great, you really need to have a 3 to 4 year survival plan. I would be pre-booking as much revenue as you possibly can, to the extent that you have vendors that you believe will still be around. I would prepay for as many products and services as you can over the next 12 months to try and lock in pricing. And I would spend more time, you know, really educating you, obviously giving great service to your existing customers, but educating them about how important it is that they make the decisions to spend with you. I think that when you open up to them as a partner and you kind of explain to them some of this information and how important, if you have a local business, that 67 cents of every dollar they spend with you stays in the local economy, you know, how you're under fire versus a big competition and that they are your ally in staying in business. I think people just get lazy and complacent and forget. And they just go back to their typical big shopping habits. But I think people want to support small business. So I would be out there telling the small business story and using that to your benefit and using your customers to, you know, not only shore up their business, but as conduits to get as much additional business as you can. And, you know, that's really the best thing that I can say on a broad base level, for small business for the next few years.
Carol Roth, check out her book, The War on Small Business, How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America. It is a must read. Carol, tell everybody where they can find the book and you.
Yes. So obviously I would be a horrible human being if I sat here talking about small businesses and didn't encourage you to buy the book from a local small business bookseller. So please do that if you can. If you don't have one or you just like to shop online, bookshop.org is a great resource, not just for this book, for all your book needs. They fulfill from local small business booksellers. So bookshop.org is something that you're going to want to remember, not only for the War on Small Business, for everything else. And then if you want to connect with me and you have a warped sense of humor, which is required, which is how David and I initially, I think, connected, you know, a decade or so ago, Carol J.S. Roth on Twitter, for as long as they let me stay on there.
It's a great Twitter feed. I'm not so active on Twitter anymore, but I definitely read certain individuals, Carol Roth being the top of that list. So greatly appreciate it. Would love to have you back on down the road. It sounds like you're working on another book about Rome and everything else. So we'll have to check that out and have you back on down the road and talk to our folks about what is going on in the small business world. Thank you so much, Carol.
My pleasure. And again, thanks to all the small business owners for being the backbone of this economy. The gratitude is to you.
Thank you.